for you life and what is good, along with death and what is evil. That's why I'm commanding you today to love the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by observing his commands, statutes, and ordinances, so that you may live long, increase, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in the land that you are about to enter to possess. But if you turn your heart away and do not obey, but instead, if you stray away to worship and serve other gods, I'm declaring to you today that you will surely be destroyed. You won't live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan River to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to testify against you today. I've set life and death before you today, both blessings and curses. Choose life, that it may be well with you, you and your children. Love the Lord your God, obey his voice, and cling to him, because he is your life, even your long life, so that you may live in the land that the Lord promised to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Thus ends the reading. May God bless our hearing of the word.
Thanks be to God.
I made a choice today, which is fitting because the sermon might be entitled Choices. Now, last time I made a choice to speak to you with very few notes. I went on for a half hour. And if you wanted to spank me on your way out, believe me, I did so myself, because I sat down with the CD, the recording, and listened to the whole thing. Just the whole thing. But I promise you I will get us out sooner today. Our reading today, which Denise did so well, thank you, Denise, and thank you to Mady, comes from the book of Deuteronomy. We don't often hear from that book. But it talks about choosing between life and death, between prosperity and adversity. It says if you make God number one in your life, it will be good for you and your children. It's a lot of promise based on our ability to choose. I'm going to say, among other things today, that I'm not sure we have all the power to choose we may sometimes think. I want to share with you a story. I had the blessing of having to do a number of jobs for many years when my ministry ended. And they were mostly humble jobs. One of them was substitute teaching. And the last 2 years of my working life before I retired were spent working with young mentally ill children, high-functioning ones in a middle school. So I got to go to different schools in the substituting, and one of them made a mark on my memory because in the beginning, as you know, schools have announcements over the PA, right? And the principal would get on, and and speak to the children at the end of the announcements. And her final words were always, "You have before you a choice to make it a good day or a bad day. The choice is yours." Now, personally, I try to live as though I'm able to choose. And I try to choose as though my choosing really matters. But in my education and in my life and in my observations and in my walk with God, I have found myself, like the Apostle Paul, choosing the wrong things a lot of times, the wrong people, the wrong behaviors, the wrong actions. And in my studies, I realized that I was being taught something very important in all my education post-high school. I had a classical education. A lot of people specialize today in technological areas, but I had the benefit of humanities. And one of the things I studied in sociology and psychology is that we are modern people who have a lot of data, and we're able to analyze that data. And we have learned that people who make bad choices also fit into certain patterns. And we often find evidence that people who make bad choices have had bad choices made to them. Family problems, culture problems, neighborhood problems, school problems, poverty, ignorance. And not to forget also that there's a certain scramble of luck in the genetic mix that we inherit. And some of us have genetic issues which can cause poor choices as well. So I always took issue in my mind with that principle because I think we put a lot of weight and pressure on our children when we tell them the choices are up to them, that they can always choose whether to make it a good day or a bad day, when in fact, it's not that simple. In fact, sin really is making a willful choice knowing you're doing something wrong. And what we find is a lot of people don't know that they're making bad choices. That's part of what growing up is all about. That's part of what being in school for kids is about. That's part of what being involved in the church community and trying to do something, maybe not quite doing it right, or maybe making a couple difficult relationships along the way. We're in a process of learning and growing. It's not always within our power to choose the right thing. Today's reading comes from the lectionary. Pastor Jeff preaches from the lectionary. It's a challenge to me to choose a reading from the lectionary rather than something I want to go with. So the Deuteronomy comes from the lectionary, and the other lectionary reading is a gospel and an epistle reading, as always, and usually a psalm. The epistle reading comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where the Apostle Paul talks to the young Corinthian church. And he says, look, you know, you folks are like infants feeding on milk. I can't talk to you about the meat of the gospel yet because you still need milk. You're like infants, but I want you to become mature so that you can start to chew on solid food. It's all very metaphorical, right? Now, these churches were made of people who had chosen Christ. They made the big choice, right? But it doesn't mean that from then on they were doing everything well. It doesn't mean that from then on they were loving well. They had to grow. And so do we. If we think that we have the power to choose right and wrong all the time, what we become are judges. We find it easy to judge bad behavior, bad attitudes, and bad words in other people because we say they could have chosen better. And I take issue with that. In fact, the Apostle Paul says we're not fighting against each other really. We're fighting against powers and principalities. And they understood, that there was a spiritual ether and that people were being influenced by it. It's that influence which can cause us to make poor choices. Now, I think we've evolved from that. Personally, I don't believe in demons that cause bad behavior or choices. I could be wrong about it. But I think we can see, when we look into people's lives and bad choices, we see the reasons I talked about earlier. Things people need help with. Things people have in their hearts and minds that they learned or picked up somewhere along the way. Methods of coping that no longer work, that worked in a dysfunctional family but no longer work in the real world. And these may as well be called powers and principalities because they're beyond most of us. They're beyond our awareness. I spent a lot of time in my life on a counselor's chair as a counselee. And I had the benefit of finding out explanations for some of my troublesome behavior and choices. Explanations I didn't know existed. And they helped me indeed and helped shape my theology and the message you're getting today. Choosing is one of those things that makes humans different than animals. So what is it that makes us different than animals? Because I always think that's a good question, because we do have an animal nature. Whatever you believe about evolution, it just takes some common sense to see that we have things common with other creatures on the earth. What makes us special humans, and one of the main things is, of course, the opposable thumbs, right? We can only go like this. You can't adequately grasp tools or do a lot of fine things. But when you can go like that, you can do all kinds of stuff because of that opposable thumb. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk more about our minds. We've developed these brains. We've developed this ability to communicate, this ability to record what we learn, to teach it to others. This makes us incredibly, vastly superior to any animal because of language and our ability to remember and our ability to be reasonable. And the fact that we can't all study everything and we can't all have good memories and we can't all be reasonable all the time. We have people who teach us. They're called and gifted by God, and they're educated, and they teach us. It's this that makes us special in the animal kingdom, but it also gives us a special responsibility. You've probably all heard that when we look back at the Old Testament, we see the law. The law was given to us to show us what goodness looks like and what sin looks like. Now, Jesus came to fulfill the law, which he brought this whole message of mercy and forgiveness. But he said not one jot or tittle of the law will be lost. And any who teach otherwise will suffer as a result. What we do have is that we have this knowledge of God. And once you come to church and you receive this knowledge of God, you're in trouble. You're in trouble because now you have choices before you, whereas before you may not have had them. So I'm going to say that really what makes us fully human and what allows us to grow and evolve as humans is we learn about God. We learn who God is and what God likes, what God doesn't like, what God says works and what doesn't work. And that sets before us choices that the unchurched world doesn't think about too often. The other thing we need to learn about is ourselves. I'd like to Pastor Jeff's sermon, I think it was last week, we talked about lenses. Was that last week? That for somehow we grow up and we're taught by family, by culture, by our own reading and reasoning, when we're very young. And that worldview becomes the lens through which we view the world, for better and for worse. As we grow and we learn about ourselves, if we can see our own lenses, if we can see our own biases, we are again in trouble. Because now we have choice. We learn about God, it gives us options. We learn that we have biases and we see things in a certain way, but there are other ways to see things. That gives us choices. Every time we evolve to become more knowledgeable of ourselves and God, we evolve in terms of having before us options. And with those options, we're challenged to choose well, as we learn God wishes us to do so. What did I say to you, Annalisa? I said, I've got to remember my smartphone, but it's right here, so that's good. And it should be queued up once I punch in the secret code. And then, here it is. Did you ever hear of Abraham Joshua Herschel, a famous writer, famous thinker, a Jewish theologian? I just came upon this the other day. It's a beautiful quote from him. And part of the gender-specific language, I'm going to read it as it is. It should be humanity, not man, but he's an old guy, you know. I think he's deceased, actually. A religious man is a person who holds God and man in one thought, who holds God and man in one thought at one time, at all times. A religious man is a person who suffers harm done to others. A religious man is someone whose greatest passion is compassion. A religious man is one whose greatest strength is love and defiance of despair. Now, when I read that, I thought, it doesn't really matter if he's describing something he has achieved. It doesn't really matter if I can measure up to that measure of a religious man. What matters is that when we have insight like this, that we set it before us as a goal. And we use our choices in life as a way to become the kind of person who can reach that goal. As part of what I've tried to do with the 20 Touchstones group, I've written these 20 touchstones, which are all basically unachievable. But it sets us up into a mindset where, as the Apostle Paul says, not that I have achieved, not that I have reached this goal, but I press on toward the goal. Not that I've gotten there already, but I press on toward the goal of the upward call in Christ Jesus our Lord. When Paul was knocked off his horse, he was shown another option. From what I understand, he spent a couple years trying to figure out what all that meant for him. And what it meant was a complete transformation. The guy who stood by and encouraged others to kill and torture Christians became Christian and spent his life not only preaching, but more or less running with those who wanted to do him harm, and eventually succeeded. The choices we make are not so much we have the power to be good or bad. choices we make are the increasing level of power with an increasing knowledge of options, that when we make them day by day, we become increasingly more like Christ. The choices we make day by day are the method by which we travel our journey in life. The choices before us from moment to moment, which usually is the choice to love, and comes in so many different forms, so many different ways of loving, so many different people, so many ways of loving without words, and ways of loving by doing, ways of loving by not doing, not speaking. So many ways of loving the world, our neighbors, Mother Earth, our spouses, our girlfriends. And it is by these choices, not that we always choose well, that we can always have power to choose a different attitude, not that we can always have power to choose to say the right thing, to build a good relationship, to do God's work in the world, on and on. But the choices that the Spirit, what was that, Ryan? The Holy Spirit puts in our hearts, through what we've learned about God, through what we listen every time we come to church every week, to help us moment to moment to make choices that keep us on that road. And my road's different than yours. I may come from the East Coast, you may come from the West, we may travel in totally opposite directions, metaphorically, but all heading to the center, right? Our center, which we believe is Jesus, and our destiny, which we believe is heaven. Our choices keep us on that path. Sometimes we can change the path, but we keep on the path the Spirit puts before us. It's not a choice to be good or bad in any one moment, to succeed or fail. It's not all that clear. Beware of anybody at any level of our world who makes clear distinctions between wrong and right, between bad people and good people, who sets up camps that fight each other because they each think the other is totally wrong. Beware of those people. Beware of those leaders. It ain't that simple. It's not that simple. But what is simple is moment to moment we get choices. And we're not always going to make the right ones, but over a lifetime, they lead us home. They lead us to God. They lead us to better relationships. They lead us to more effective work. They lead us to more effective discipleship. And someday, with God's help, which I believe is effective, we will be led home. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for your message to me today, and I pray that with your Spirit's editing, it will be useful to individuals, to this church. We thank you for your word, for your message of love, for your promise of salvation. In Jesus' name.